From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. A production of iHeartRadio.
Hello, welcome back to the show. My name is Matt.
My name is Noel.
They call me Ben. We're joined, as always, with our super producer, Paul Mission Control Decant. Most importantly, you are here, and that makes this the stuff they don't want you to know as we are flying headlong into 2023. We looked around at each other and we said we're overdue for a solid episode on ghost, on the paranormal. And earlier, if you'll recall, Matt, you had asked whether we had a nice one and done topic. You know, we get bogged down, rightly so, in continuing geopolitical events. And as soon as you asked this question, Matt, the answer came back instantly. What was that? What did we come up with when you asked about a solid one and done paranormal episode?
Yeah, I asked about that because, you know, sometimes we do two-parters, right? And we want to release the episodes on usually a Wednesday and Friday, so you get to hear them in the same week. But we were doing this one today because Ben shot back immediately haunted airplanes and...
Yeah, you know, like the Spruce Goose or the Spirit of St. Louis. No, not that. But I've always thought the Spirit of St. Louis sounded kind of haunted.
Well,
it's a great name.
No, whichever one we were talking about, just the phrase alone made us all go, yes.
So here we go. Wheels up. Please make sure your lap belts are fastened.
Tray tables.
Tray tables up.
Tray tables up. Make sure your seat is not reclined. Here are the facts. Okay, look. Airplanes are amazing. All right? Take that, birds. We got up there too, says humanity. And airplanes are not quite as newfangled as we might assume. You know, I think for a lot of people, you have probably seen or driven or rode in a vehicle on the ground of some sort. But airplanes still are a thing that not all 8 billion plus people are going to experience directly. You might see it in the sky, right? It's rarefied air to ride in one. It's even more rare for someone to pilot one, but they're not really that new. Like Carl Benz of Mercedes-Benz fame is often cited as, we have to be careful with inventions here, often cited as the first person to get a gas-powered automobile to the commercial market. And that happened in 1885. Less than 20 years after that, there were some really focused nerds, let's be honest, the Wright brothers, and they made a pretty cool proof of concept. They had a powered flight at a place called Kitty Hawk in the United States in 1903, and they hit on something, right? They hit on that screw you birds energy, right? Like for centuries, people have dreamed of flying. There's that old Far Side cartoon about the caveman seeing a bird fly and deciding between inventing a flight machine of its own or inventing a bow and arrow and then just shooting the bird.
Well, you know, anyone that's either shooting birds or saying screw you to birds is all right with me. So I fully support this, you know, because birds are for the birds. But so are like airplane prototypes that don't always get the job done.
There are a lot of really cool ideas that just didn't work out, okay?
Nope. Mm-hmm. Definitely not.
There are a lot of people who died attempting flight. A lot of human beings throughout history tried to invent ways to fly and did not meet with the same success of the Wright brothers. And it's weird because the human species has thought of flight and mortality often in the same cognitive breath, like death in so many religions is portrayed as this ascendant experience. Your body is gone. Your soul rises to the heavens or the sky. And there's something so primal about the idea, right? The idea that every groundling will have. Why am I up here? Why am I in this tube? How fast is this going? Are we okay? Calm me down. Give me some peanuts or some pretzels. You know what I mean?
Cracker
Maybe
Jacks.
more coffee.
Sorry.
Or Cracker Jacks?
I felt like we were going into that. That song.
Take me out of the ball game. This is as American as baseball or apple pie or dying in a test flight.
Ooh.
Oh boy. That's good. Also, some people who are listening today, some of our fellow listeners, love being on planes. Some people absolutely hate it. Now, Matt and Noel and I have been in situations where we get a call or some sort of communique that requires us to be wheels up pretty quickly. And so we are familiar with planes, perhaps more so than the average person who is not in the aviation industry. But I keep thinking about this very American fascination with planes in general, right? Motorized flight invented in the U.S., and then also one of the most iconic Twilight Zone episodes ever.
Incredible.
Yeah, it's William Shatner freaking out at the window seat of a plane.
Well, and and despite how corny it looks to this day, it still captures and capitalizes on, I think, a fear that a lot of people still have. I think maybe the three of us take for granted a little bit that we can fly without experiencing existential terror. But I think we all have friends that cannot. Just the act itself of being in the sky. Matt's raising his hand there. Not a fan. Some people just it's nothing to them, and some people you got to take a Dramamine or you're going to be clutching the walls like Bugs Bunny in that parody of said Twilight Zone episode that Looney Tunes did, where there's a gremlin terrorizing Bugs Bunny on a fighter plane.
I think the fear that a lot of people have is a lack of control. You when you're in a vehicle driving around, if you're the driver, you at least feel as though you are in control, even though your control is based on the actions of all the people around you. But when you're in a plane, there's two people up there, literally two people, and they're the ones. If anything happens to them, sorry.
Yeah, well, three. There's a flight engineer, there's a whole team of, there's air traffic controllers, some of the most stressed out people I have ever met in over a long period of meeting humans.
But there's two on the plane that know how it works really, really well.
Yeah. I mean, you don't want just one person, right? You want two people. You want some checks and balances. And for a lot of our fellow conspiracy realists, this idea of tying religious or spiritual or paranormal significance to a vehicle, it might sound weird, but if we pull back and we look at the larger context, we see that there are many urban legends, there are many pieces of folklore that take place in transit, like ghostly hitchhikers. Before that, ghost riders in the sky, all that stuff. And then, of course, haunted ships, Mary Celeste, and so on. For a lot of people, still, despite all the stuff you hear, you might find plane travel untrustworthy. And it's strange because we see the discrepancy between intellectually knowing something, being aware of facts and statistics, versus experientially encountering something. Like you said, Matt, you might be someone hopping on a plane and you might be very, very weirded out on a primal level, right? Some part of your reptilian brain is saying, I'm not supposed to be this high up unless I've got a mountain under my feet. And I don't care what the statistics say, even though multiple studies have proven that flying is in fact way safer than driving or riding in a car.
Well, I love you mentioned that reptile brain thing because Matt and I think, experienced that in person, or at least Matt tried to get me to do one of these VR headset things where like you walk out on a plank when he first got his Oculus or whatever a couple years ago. And I in my living room, I couldn't do it. Like I was so arrested by the whole three-dimensional kind of immersiveness of it that I couldn't bring myself to it. I eventually, got up the courage and did it once I got one of my own. But that very night I refused to do it, despite knowing that I was standing on my carpet. And the graphics aren't even that good. It's kind of like Sims level graphics,
Yeah. But despite the fact that if you are actually in a plane flying through the air, your feet not strapped down to anything that's attached to the earth in a very unnatural feeling way, it is much safer, as you said, Ben, because do you want to talk about the odds?
Yeah, let's do the odds. Let's roll the dice. Let's see.
Okay, so we have a quote here from a Harvard study that found the odds of being in an accident during a flight is 1 in 1.2 million. 1 in 1.2 million. And the chances of that accident being fatal are 1 in 11 million. That's pretty good. Those are good chances. What about if you're driving a car?
1 in 5,000 in the European Union, Australia, and the United States. Also, there's a weird thing. Planes seem to be getting safer over time. Think about it. If you're one of the big car manufacturers of the world, you can work around the clock to improve the safety of vehicles. You can try your best to build a vehicle that will keep the passengers alive if something goes sideways, but you can't really do anything when that vehicle gets on the road, right? And people are driving around 80 plus miles an hour with the weird system of painted lines that we have pointed out, are cartoonish in previous episodes. With planes, because there are far fewer planes than there are cars, flying is statistically safer. Your road trip is more dangerous than your flight. That's just the truth.
Yeah, your safety isn't just dependent on the choices of that person next to you or those, 500 3,000 other people on that same highway you're on. It's based on the pilots. And as you said, Ben, the control system, the seriously accurate, intense control system that is used to know where flights are at any given time, right? Even though sometimes it does fail for just a couple hours.
Well, we saw a big, massive chain reaction when that thing happened. And it was just, a lot of these systems are kind of antiquated, in terms of the front end systems, the actual computer software and the hardware that frankly is a little bit out of date, along with the planes themselves. I mean, we've seen, planes that still have cigarette ashtrays, in the seat arms and, things like that just... Why are these still here? It makes you kind of scratch your head a little bit. And it's because of all these fleets are serious need of update.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. And you can see this in flight safety standards across the planet, which are not uniform. We would be remiss if we did not mention a very recent plane crash in Nepal. And this was a fatal crash. It has currently resulted in the deaths of at least 68 people. It was the most deadly plane crash in 30 years for Nepal. Additionally, a lot of people are avoiding flights or thinking twice about it because they've heard the news about things like the Boeing 737 MAX. This resulted in some heavy financial consequences for Boeing. Of course,
and hundreds of lives lost.
Yeah, yes. And hundreds of people died, and also none of the people at Boeing are going to jail.
Well, and there was a recent story, I think from January 13th, maybe, of this year, about the the flight to Hawaii that experienced intense turbulence. Do you remember hearing about that, guys? There was a recent story out of NBC News that was talking about this very strange plume of turbulent, essentially cloud that was extremely turbulent and caused a bunch of injuries on the flight, which it has nothing to do with the plane and how it's built and its safety features. It was more like just an atmospheric phenomena that occurred that caused a problem.
A horrific pothole. You're sitting in your seat, right? And maybe you ignored the little light that comes on that tells you to wear your seatbelt. And all of a sudden, you are in some non-consensual chiropractic appointments with a roof.
Well, in that situation, it was between 1 and 3 seconds between visually seeing the plume that shot up like in front of the plane and being able to alert everybody on board. It's just nuts. That scares me, guys.
Yeah, it should. Also, the crews of commercial airlines as well as military airlines or aircraft, I should say, are holding safety as the number one priority. In 99% of the cases, those flight attendants who have to put up with so much trash from so many people, their number one function is safety. It's not to give you peanuts or even Cracker Jacks, but then there are other things that scare you if you don't love airplanes. The idea that planes famously go missing. The world is big. The ocean is most of it. Sometimes stuff just disappears. We talked about this previously. Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 is probably one of the most famous recent examples. The cause of the crash or disappearance is still not officially confirmed. There are various theories regarding it, but that was just in 2014. Not too long ago, and I found a piece from a British tabloid called The Mirror about how people were still finding debris from that craft as recently as 2017. A piece of it was being used as an ironing board.
Well, that's the kind of thing. I mean, ships, planes, even some vehicles have gone missing. There are at least legends of those kinds of disappearances that persist often. That is certainly the one that I think about the most, Ben, but we're going to talk about at least one other one in this episode that just kind of baffles you for a little while, at least.
Right. It's spooky. You know what I mean? If you are hopping on to a plane and you have no control over the craft, you are a lot like people hopping onto a boat, right? And going off towards some blue horizon. You might feel a little better if you have some superstitions. You might, like, have you ever been on a plane and someone claps when the plane lands?
Yeah, that's a little unnerving, isn't it?
It's
at that point, it's like obviously all good, but it's sort of like, was this a surprise? Are we surprised about this? Yeah.
It's true. There are all sorts of superstitions in the world of aviation, just like there are in maritime exploration. Of course, some of it's very basic. You're a pilot in a cockpit. Hey, don't make jokes about planes crashing. That's just bad taste. But it gets really specific. And if you look at the folklore of it, a lot of those aviation superstitions tend to date back to World War II. Planes were making the scene in a big way, and they were also way less reliable. And, fine. Everybody listening to this is, statistically speaking, alive. So there's nothing wrong with a little superstition if it makes you feel better, right?
It reminds me a lot of professional athletes who have some small thing they do before every game or the day before a game, or, when they go, like a basketball player that does a specific dribble, before they shoot a free throw. It reminds me of that kind of ritualization. But man, Ben, you found a list that has some stuff in there.
Ooh, what do we got? Did you like any?
Oh, I like a lot of them. There's one quote. It's number 7 on the list that you sent, and it's an Air Force F-84 pilot who would always duck under the intake and exhaust. So like the engines, when he's going around doing his pre-flight check. And his quote was that if you let the engines see you, it will kill you. Like, don't like, but making the plane a thing, like a creature, right? That you kind of have to be wary of.
I mean, it is kind of a respect thing. I think with any large vessel, there's a certain amount of deference that's paid and superstition that goes into those kinds of things. It's like the moment you take it for granted, it will chew you up and spit you out.
And that's an article from Carly Courtney over at disciplesofflight.com. This is a real thing. And again, if you are not hurting anyone, then you're doing your thing that makes you comfortable, just like an athlete, right? That's what a pilot is in many ways. And the question is, how far does this belief in the paranormal or this practice of superstition go when you're up there in the clouds? And any one thing going wrong can reacquaint you with the ground in a way that might not be advantageous to you. Are any planes carrying more than mortal passengers? Are any airplanes actually haunted? We're going to pause for a word from our sponsors. Adjust your safety belts and please remember to put the oxygen mask on yourself before you put it on your neighbor. In the meantime, we'll be right back. Here's where it gets crazy. All right. Anybody been on a haunted airplane?
I don't think so. I hope not. Yet. Yeah.
Not yet. I love the optimism. Well, it turns out that there are haunted airplanes depending on the people that you ask. There's, like you teased earlier, Matt, there's one plane in particular that's very popular for being haunted, or not quite haunted. It's treated as sentient. It reminded me of the objects in that video game Control. Matt, you're the one who hit me to the game Control. Noel, have you played that game?
No, I think it's one that you guys have talked about and sounded incredibly appealing. Isn't it sort of like a timey-wimey, weird, like parallel universe thing involving some psychic powers?
Yeah, man, it's weird horror, cool. Baby.
Yeah, it sounds
Ben's
great.
Talking about objects of power, man.
That's
some
what they call
his corrupted objects of power.
PS?
Yeah,
what
on
PlayStation.
System?
Okay, cool. I'm gonna check into that right after we finish. But no, this is right up my wheelhouse. Up my wheelhouse? In my wheelhouse? Up my alley? Whatever you want to call it.
In your flight deck?
Hey, thank you.
Itinerary, whatever. We are not ourselves aviators. None of us have a pilot license. Although I think at one point Matt had a pretty slick pair of aviator sunglasses. I can't remember.
I have friends that have pilot's licenses.
Oh, wow. Okay. Nice.
I don't need one. They
can be aviators, so look cool.
Yeah. Those are just for me.
I don't know, Noel. Matt looks like Matt, not to profile you here, but it looks like you're the type of dude with the right sunglasses that if you strolled into a regional airport with a confident air, I think you could get in a cockpit. I think you could.
I'd have to buy a suit and like a lapel or whatever they put on there. Yeah, but we can make it work.
All right, good. We're always planning some sort of heist. We'll get to this weird object of power, or this weird purportedly sentient plane, but first we've got to look at the non-supernatural real instances of what are called ghost flights or ghost planes, because they are two very real street names for some very strange things.
So there are a couple of technical terms, I guess you could call them, for these things. We've got ghost plane or ghost flight, which is a term that's used in commercial aviation circles to describe a formerly pretty rare practice in which an airline conducts a regularly scheduled flight with a plane containing less than 10% of the flight's total capacity.
Oh, dare to dream. Can you imagine?
What a treat that would be. I imagine, Ben, these are just tests. Or like, what's the point of these? It seems like that, fuel being so expensive. I understand why these would be rare, but what is the purpose? Doesn't seem like there's anything fishy or supernatural going on here.
They got to keep their spots at airports. Commercial airliners have to still land a plane to
stay in the kitty, I guess.
Yeah. And
that's interesting. And I guess during COVID, when nobody was flying, this maybe had a little bit of an uptick.
Just so, yeah.
And you may think, why would you still send a plane all the way across the ocean or something if it's only got 10% capacity? The company isn't making money, right? You're still paying everybody. You're still paying for all the fuel. That doesn't make sense. As you guys said, it makes sense to... for the company for other reasons. The other problem is that plane is still spewing all that exhaust up into the atmosphere. And people don't like that.
Yeah. Ghost flights accelerated during, increased maybe would be the best word, during the pandemic. And these airlines who were, they were hemorrhaging money. They needed to maintain their regularly scheduled flights. That's why outfits like Delta in the United States started carrying freight, right? Because they needed to hold that spot, just as you said, Noel. There's another very real and very uncool thing that the phrase ghost plane or flight describes. It's a specific type of crash, and it is thankfully not a crash that happens often, but has occurred multiple times.
Yeah, it's because these planes have very sophisticated autopilot systems. And this term describes what happens if an entire flight crew, as well as maybe even passengers on board a plane, all are incapacitated in one way or another, often by hypoxia, where the cabin of the plane is depressurized in a way that there's not enough oxygen for everybody to breathe. And when that happens, it's not good. So if you imagine a ghost flight or a ghost plane that's still full of passengers and a flight crew, but everybody in there is asleep or, dying essentially, but the plane is still aloft, flying around, maybe doing a circle over a city, waiting to land. That's really disturbing and creepy.
Did y'all watch that show Station 11? Is that what it was called?
Mm-hmm.
It was about kind of a post-apocalyptic kind of thing about like a virus. That dude, Hiro Murai, directed a bunch of it, and I just thought it was really fabulous. But there's a situation where there's a ghost plane, it's a plane full of people infected with this plague, and they essentially are not allowed to leave the plane. So it's a different kind of ghost plane.
Yeah. And it's not too far away from a possible future. Matt, one thing that I really appreciate that you pointed out was the Helios flight 522. That, again, this is the ghost flight hypoxia stuff has occurred in multiple instances and continues to occur in the recent day. Could you tell us a little bit about Helios?
Yes, Ben, this is a flight. It was Helios Airways flight 522. It occurred on August 14th, 2005. And it was a situation where the plane went up, cabin was depressurized, not enough oxygen inside. The crew was unable to stop it from happening. And it goes back to that situation. Put your mask on, like you said, Ben, on yourself before your loved ones or anybody else. They were just unable to do anything, and the flight ended up circling over a city until the fuel ran out, basically. So the whole thing's on autopilot, and nobody could do anything about it. The military even scrambled jets to check on the thing, and they could see that there was nobody in the pilot seat, or at least they couldn't see anyone in the pilot seat, but they could see the co-pilot slumped over the controls. Wow. And a couple of windows were open, and there were people with the masks down that they looked like they were incapacitated. And that's all they could see, and the flight's just going around and around and around.
Shout out to everybody listening to this episode on a plane. Hope you're having a great time. Also, we'll get to some of the paranormal stuff as well. We needed to establish that there are real things, real events that you will hear described as ghost planes or ghost flights. If you go to the idea of haunted planes, you'll see tons of apocryphal stories. You know, the perfect kind of like unsolved mystery, Time Life presents legends, tall tales about ghosts. You know, there's stories of ghostly children voices talking over the radio to air traffic control. And then there are stories of passengers who are not on a manifest just appearing and then saying something cryptic or heartwarming to someone on the crew or someone in line for the restroom. And then they're like, hey, go tell the passenger in 27A that, you know, she was right. I'm sorry. I love her. And then they vanish. This is one of the most interesting ones in decades past. Stories of planes that disappear only to return decades later, hundreds of miles away from their destination. And these are some of the legends that I think were treated as fact by a lot of people when they first read about this. Some of them sound like bunk. I mean, straight out of the Weekly World News, which, spoiler, they were.
Yeah, or the National Enquirer. This one, as you said, been actually the Weekly World News, an actual tabloid.
Was there a picture associated with this story? Because those are always the best when they have a like poorly photoshopped image, you know, massively printed and clearly forged.
Elvis Presley is pregnant. Bat Boy refuses to pay alimony.
Yeah.
Oh, Jesus.
Bad Boy caught in Night Out Horror Show.
All right, well, let's tell the tale of Pan Am Flight 914.
That's right. Pan Am Flight 914 was a Douglas DC-4 with 57 passengers and 6 crew members bound for Miami, Florida on July 2nd, 1955. Takes off from New York City. The flight was scheduled to last just a couple of hours. Such a short flight, but it never arrived in Miami.
Instead, the story goes, it showed up unannounced and invisible to radar on March 9th, 1985. 30 years later.
In Caracas, you know, like yeah. Air traffic controllers are going, wait, what? So for a few years after this story hits the news, ufologists and various fringe researchers love to go back and forth with this. What happened? You know, why won't Uncle Sam or Venezuela really talk about Pan Am Flight 914? Because it never happened. It's a story.
What?
It's completely fictional. I know. It was published in Weekly World News in 1985, the same year that paper claimed this flight had mysteriously reappeared. And then further, as we can see, Weekly World News published basically the same story 2 times in the 1990s, and they switched it up a little bit. And they said, okay, this flight did disappear in 1955, just like you said, Noel, but this time it landed in 1992. Total fabrication. Yeah.
Dang. That made me so excited because it would be a real wormhole situation, guys. And I've been longing for a real wormhole situation.
Every time I'm on a flight and it lands, if I ever fall asleep on a plane And you guys know I rarely sleep. If I ever fall asleep on a plane, I'm just hoping that when it lands, I'll be in a totally different, like timeline, right?
Dinosaurs?
Have you guys ever read The Langoliers?
Yes,
by Stephen King. Yeah, that's a cool plane time travel, timey-wimey kind of story. I've been listening to a podcast, quick shout outs, called Just King Things. And it's these two really smart fellows that are going through every single one of Stephen King's books in publication order. And I'm listening to some, even if I haven't read the books, but many of them I have. And they point out that King often mentions the Bermuda Triangle and then the idea of like weird stuff happening over that part of the ocean. Not to mention, Ben, I think a favorite trope of yours with King is haunted or sentient or haunted inanimate objects, specifically vehicles. Whether it be Christine with the car, or the Mangler, which was about a haunted laundry machine. I don't know. I just think it's an interesting trope in sci-fi that King kind of spearheaded and sort of made it a thing. I don't know. I think it's neat. Makes me wonder if he took any inspiration from any of these stories that we're talking about today.
I'm sure he read the Weekly World News. Come on. Stephen King had that stuff.
Classy fella. Yeah.
Imagine all the cool stories that you could find and glean from that stuff.
Mm-hmm. And another example would be Santiago Flight 513. What happens with this Santiago flight?
Well, it's 1954, and according to the story, you guys, this Santiago Airlines flight, number 513, it took off from Germany on its way to Brazil, and it disappeared while flying over the Atlantic. Okay, I mean, that's horrifying and terrible. That would make the news. But what happened next is truly supernatural.
Yes, it did eventually land in Brazil in 1989, and when the ground crew at the Brazilian airport approached this flight, they found the plane intact, but it looked weathered, and every seat inside had a skeleton in there, dried and desiccated, as though aeons had passed. Spoiler, they did not use the word aeons because that's too out of bounds for the vocabulary of the Weekly World News, which also made up this story. So
it was like the Draugr, it's a plane full of Draugr.
I like that, Matt.
What are the protections that the Weekly World News enjoy that allows them to just print whatever bullshit, they like?
The First Amendment?
Yeah, but I mean, there's also laws against screaming fire, in a crowded space. I mean, not that that's the journalistic equivalent of what they're doing exactly, but I guess it must be just, it's so beyond the bounds of credibility that, who would believe it. And also, the reputation of the publication. But I don't know. It's supposed to be the same thing that allows the Onion to operate.
You know what it reminds me of, Ben? The first episode of Fringe that you made me watch, and then I ended up watching the whole dang thing.
People don't make people do things. People shouldn't. Your choices are your own. But I was thinking of Fringe as well. I mean, humanity has always been captivated with the idea of transit, right? And so a new form of transit must seem somehow magical, especially if it's something you cannot do on your own. Sorry, human beings, currently none of you can fly unaided. There are some people who are good at gliding, and they also inevitably end up on the ground. 100% of them. There's another story, though, that is not from the Weekly World News. It's a story that is illustrative of the folklore, right? The modern folklore surrounding the concept of haunted airplanes and aircraft. It's the story of Eastern Airlines Flight 401. I don't know about you all, but I had not heard of this one at all until we started digging into this episode. And to keep it 100% here, I'm surprised I didn't hear about it because it was quite a big deal in pop culture, which becomes part of the problem. But it was a real flight, and it was a genuine tragedy. And Miami comes up again in this story.
We're talking specifically about Eastern Airlines Flight 401, which departed from New York for Miami on December 29th, 1972. This was a Lockheed L-1011, which crashed in IRL into the Florida Everglades, which, as we know, is full of creepy crawlies that can eat human remains. Both pilots and the flight engineer died, along with 2 out of the 10 flight attendants and 96 out of the 163 passengers aboard, with 75 survivors. A researcher by the name of John Fuller actually wrote a book about this. Came out in 1976 called The Ghost of Flight 401. And he said that the crash was only the beginning of this tragedy.
Yeah, because a tragedy it was, but some of the parts from that crash were still functioning and able to be taken, away from the crash site and placed into another vehicle that needed servicing, needed a spare part or something. It's a strange thing, guys. I didn't know that was even a practice. Like, once a flight had crashed.
I don't know if it is. It feels ghoulish, doesn't it? Especially if you're a commercial airliner. Military, different calculation. But yeah, the idea that you would find this crash, and the plane was found, and there were survivors. The idea that you would say, okay, now that the news has died down, let's look around. Let's see, is this seat still good? Can we put this seat on another semi-identical plane? That's the story.
It goes through such a large forensics time period, right? Where they're recreating the crash site and all of that stuff within a hangar somewhere, and they just spend years with it, analyzing it. And just to then take it afterwards and repurpose. Yeah, you're right. It's weird.
Yeah, ghoulish again.
Have you guys ever heard the delightfully idiotic question, or maybe it's just a meme, of why don't they make the whole plane out of the stuff they make the black box out of?
Well, then it wouldn't fly.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah. No, that's a good point. Yeah. No, it's a good question, and it's a good point.
It's funny, but it's also silly because, I mean, obviously, to make an impervious, lockbox of information that would survive being in a crash and hit by, heavy arms, probably have to be made of some pretty serious stuff that would probably sink a plane if the whole thing was made of it.
In the end, we're very squishy. And if we're inside something as impenetrable as we want it to be, we are pretty squishy.
Oh, we're squished. Yeah. You always wonder, it's that moment when you realize, oh, I'm supposed to wear a seatbelt on a plane in case it takes a serious dive, and then my meat body just flies up against the ceiling and all my bones get crushed. I'm like, why are they harping on the seatbelt so much?
Or how Tony Stark in the Iron Man suit never seems to bump against the interior of the suit the whole time. It's a huge plot hole. Anyway,
magical technology they haven't exactly revealed to us.
No, it's beautiful. It's beautiful to have heroes. That's cool. So over the following years, the story goes, there were rumors this aircraft, 318, technically N318EA, that had some of these salvaged parts from this horrific crash. It became home to ghosts, and passengers and crew alike on these Eastern airline flights would see folks like the flight engineer or the captain or a dead passenger sitting on the plane, moving around. And again, according to legend, Eastern Airlines eventually said, you know what? We're going to remove these salvaged parts from 318. And when they did, the hauntings stopped. The souls had been put to rest. This became a part of popular culture. I'm so surprised that none of us heard about this. I certainly didn't. Before we went on air today, we played a brief trailer of a made-for-TV film by NBC starring Ernest Borgnine called The Ghost of Flight 401, based off that author's book. And then, I didn't even know about this, there was a guy named Bob Welch who was a member of Fleetwood Mac for a time. but not like a long-term member. And he recorded a song about Flight 401 on his solo album, Three Hearts, from 1979. I'm being too radio DJ about it. We're not going to play the song.
Yeah. Well,
we can't afford it.
We can't afford to play the song.
But, even today, despite the story of the spare parts being replaced, ceasing the haunting, there are still reports from like 2020 about this thing happening. And people seeing ghosts on planes flying over the Everglades, specifically ghosts from Flight 401.
Mm-hmm. And this was mentioned in non-fringe research circles. Flight Safety Foundation, a trade newsletter, mentions the crash in an issue they put out in 1974. This is a publicity nightmare for this airline. We found a book called From the Captain to the Colonel, an informal history of Eastern Airlines, written by a guy named Robert J. Serling. And in this book, the CEO of Eastern Airlines at the time, a former astronaut, by the way, named Frank Borman, says these ghost stories are garbage. And you can also find a little bit of back and forth about people deciding whether or not to sue each other. Side note, that Robert Serling guy, older brother of Rod Serling, who went on to create the Twilight Zone. Yeah, so I think when we see aviation episodes of Twilight Zone, maybe check with Rod about Robert. Also, people are out here still naming their kids with the same first letter. I guess it's convenient. You know what I mean?
Bob and Rod.
Bob and Rod. Actually, that sounds really cool. No, I retract my earlier comment. That is a good plan. So in this book, Robert Serling, not Twilight Zone, Rod Serling, old Robbie, says no wreckage from Flight 401 ever made it onto another plane. And no one at Eastern Airlines could find anyone, crew or passenger, who genuinely claimed to see a ghost firsthand. It's always a story I heard from someone who met someone who saw something. You know what I mean? And this is where we have to give a shout out to Brian Dunning over at the Skeptoid podcast, who believes that he's traced the pop culture growth of this to a very bad off-color joke about aircraft 318 making an emergency landing in Mexico City. It's still, like you mentioned earlier, Noel, is still an L-1011. It's just a different iteration. And this pilot joked about this emergency landing and said, it was scary. For a minute, I thought Don Repo's ghost was on the plane. Don Repo was the flight engineer for the ill-fated 401. He perished in the crash. So maybe that's how this folklore starts, right? Someone makes a joke. That joke gets taken seriously. It accelerates. People embellish it, maybe to make a buck, maybe because they don't have all the facts. And now you get into these increasingly surreal situations. Speaking of surreal, we did promise you that we would introduce you to one crazy, crazy guy. So we're going to take a pause for a word from our sponsors, and we'll return. What better way to land the episode than to talk about Deli Mike?
And we're back. So, Ben, Deli Mike, is this a guy that makes sandwiches? What are we talking about?
Deli Mike! We're talking about Deli Mike or Deli Mike.
Is this like a Jersey Mike kind of situation, or?
It'd be so cool, right? We probably, one of our fellow listeners might have the street name Deli Mike. And Mike, if you're hearing this, we want to figure out what your sandwich situation is. We're going to be on the road. Want to stop at your deli. In Turkish, Deli Mike means crazy Mike. This is the street name of an infamous Airbus A340, probably the most famous quote unquote haunted plane in the world today.
Yeah. Deli Mike, or Deli Mike, Mayk, or Mike, like we would spell shorthand for Michael, or Crazy Mike in Turkish, what that translates to, became a part of the Turkish Airlines fleet in 1996. It was designed and intended to operate long-haul flights out of Turkey. From 1996 to 2019, Deli Mike was kind of had this reputation almost. Ben, you described it beautifully as sort of being like a bit of a bad boy of the skies with a little bit of an edge, right?
Yeah, prank-loving eccentric. This is an object of power. For anybody familiar with Control, the video game, or familiar with SCP lore on the internet, Mike seemed to have random technical issues. Sometimes cabin lights would turn on, seemingly of their own volition, and then the crew would come to investigate, and they'd turn off, like, haha, you didn't get me yet. All right, tag, not it, or whatever. The crew also apparently, there's a bunch of lore around this, and a lot of it's mainly in Turkish media. The crew would get attendant calls. You hit the little call flight attendant button, and they would be sent to the wrong seat. Haha, classic Mike. Or a passenger would try to turn on their reading light, and they would see another reading light turn on for a different seat. Now, for a lot of us familiar with electrical wiring, this sounds like maybe somebody just got their wires crossed, right?
It sounds an awful lot like that. Almost exactly like that, in fact. But there's weirder stuff too. There's one situation where the emergency lights, that are on the floor, those had a tendency to begin, like they're off, imagine. They would begin to turn on in a wave. So from the back of the plane, sweeping all the way to the front. In an almost playful manner, or like a staged manner.
We're anthropomorphizing a little bit, but you kind of have to really enjoy it, right? It's like, if you've ever been at a stadium during a game and people do the wave en masse in a crowd, you want to be part of it. You want to be cool. So apparently flight attendants took this to mean Crazy Mike, Deli Mike, was in a good mood. The most famous stories about this plane hinge on flight instruments. Apparently, there was an emergency signal emitted in the cockpit. Edit me here, Paul. A kind of signal that would indicate an oh shit moment. And this terrified some of the newer crew members. But the old hands, the people who have been with this plane for a while, said, it's just, that's Mike. Just, give him a second. Let him take a breather. Give him 10. Give him 10. We'll get off this runway. Don't worry. Don't you worry about it. And then we've got I think, at least for me, you guys, this is my favorite story about Crazy Mike. It's a story of an old engineer who apparently knew Mike quite well.
So one day there was an instrument malfunction, and the crew could not get the plane back online, or couldn't get it back to its, specs, its baseline kind of standards. Legend has it they called in an old technician familiar with Mike, very intimately familiar. The old fellow knocked on the cockpit door, walked in and said, "What happened to you, big man?" Then the old tech hung out with the pilots for a bit before strolling away into the sunset, never physically working on the plane, never actually touching the component in question, the malfunctioning component. And apparently the conversation was plenty pleasant, because right after that, everything went right back to normal. All of the haywire kind of readouts started to level out, didn't they?
And crazy.
It's almost as though this man was calming to the plane. He coaxed it into behaving correctly again.
And Crazy Mike's back in the sky. I love this idea. this is, again, apocryphal, but there are people in Turkish Airlines who will swear by it. I love this idea that you could walk in and kind of have this moment. Off air, Matt, you brought up something that I had forgotten about. Our one-time fearless leader and a mentor to us regularly spoke with finicky machines.
Yes, much in the same way as this story. If there was a problem that, let's say, just for instance, I assumed it was a software issue, maybe even a hardware issue. When something was malfunctioning with my Mac and I just couldn't get things to work right, I'd get frustrated and try and figure out and solve the problem, like, again, via software or hardware. And Roxanne would stroll in and just be like, just gently put her hand on the machine, be like, oh, it's okay, buddy. It'll be all right. It's all right. Let's just take a minute. Let's just relax a little bit. And talking to my computer, not to me.
Right. Yes. Yeah. I remember that. I've seen similar moments. What I also recall is that the temperature would drop down a few degrees Fahrenheit during those conversations, which I
don't remember that.
Well, that was my perception, but perhaps my perception is incorrect. Yeah, a lot of our fellow listeners right now, if you work around machinery, especially complex machinery, then you may also find yourself, maybe muttering under your breath, like, come on, just not today. Don't do this to me today, Tyson, or whatever you call, whatever your name for your machine is. And again, if it's a superstition, it's not hurting anyone, you're fine, you're good to go. But is it possible that talking to an inanimate object, right, or a non-sentient thing may have some sort of result? A lot of people believe something like that. Low key, a lot of people believe that. And Mike here, our pal Mike, is treated less like a quote unquote haunted plane and more like a friendly, quirky, sentient object. It's like, if it's a ghost, it's like Slimer and Ghostbusters. It is mischievous, little pinch of the cheeks, but not out to actually harm anyone.
I don't know, man. I mean, he was a little chaotic in the movie. He was a little more of a familiar in the real Ghostbusters cartoon, but I always found him horrifying in the first Ghostbusters movie. He's kind of comes at you, drooling all the while.
Yeah, and he does slime people. Hence the name.
Indeed.
I always wondered about his background too. Like, was he ever a human being? What was his life
funny
like?
You should. That guy. Oh my gosh, there's this guy, Max Landis, who I think got kind of canceled for some bad male behavior, but he did do a interesting YouTube video, I think, before this happened, where he talked about his Ghostbusters sequel, where it explains Slimer's backstory. So if you're interested, just look up Max Landis' Ghostbusters sequel. He does have a pretty clever pitch for what Slimer's backstory was.
Nice. But Mike in this case was not like Slimer in that way. He was he didn't harm anybody. I just want to bring this up right before we end here, guys. I was reading about an accident that Deli Mike got into at some point in 2011. They called it what do they call it? They call it an excursion. I believe it's where when the plane lands, it goes off the runway just a bit, but nobody was harmed in that, I guess, incident. But it did, cause some pretty significant damage to the landing gear when it occurred. And then, that landing gear, that piece of Deli Mike had to get replaced. And there's a story, I can't remember which link it was in, Ben, but it's one of the links you shared. There's a story that all of the component parts of Deli Mike's electronics over the years had been replaced completely because
the ship of Theseus. Okay.
Yes, because the engineers were like, well, clearly there's something wrong with the wiring that we're just not able to see. So let's replace this entire thing, every component. And it still did its weird stuff.
Yeah, get him, Mike. So this, that is, I read about the landing gear as well. And this idea of slowly replacing every component of a thing. And if that idea of the thing is still the same, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. And also we have to ask about the nature of perception and observation. To what degree does the human mind interfere with something when it observes that thing, right? That action, that activity, that relationship. Folks, you can see all sorts of, again, quirky, fun reports about our guy, Crazy Mike, our plane, I should say, and the hijinks that is attributed to this Airbus. But a lot of those have what I would call big slow news day vibes. You know, they're, hey, look at that kind of things. They're not, what does this mean? Reports. We wanted to end on a good note. So ultimately, our pal, and hopefully yours, Crazy Mike, Deli Mike, was retired and stored in Johannesburg, South Africa. And just last month, as we record this, in December of 2022, Crazy Mike and a couple other Airbuses, all from Turkish Airlines, retired, were flown out to Uzbekistan on December 24th, Christmas Eve for the Christians, and they got derailed. They made an emergency landing in Tehran, and Dutch media speculates that Iran may have done this on purpose to get around Western sanctions for buying new aircraft. So right now, our pal, Crazy Mike, is living it up in Tehran. He's on another adventure, bro. Crazy stuff, you know? Well, that's our episode on haunted airplanes. And I think none of us have encountered ghostly stuff on airplanes, but we've all been in surreal situations on airplanes. You meet people in a weird liminal space. I'm curious, Matt, Noel, do you think we might have anybody listening to the show today or tonight who has a paranormal experience on aircraft?
There's also a really good heavy metal segment in the heavy metal animated film, not the more recent one, the heavy metal 2000 something, but the one from like the 80s, where there's like a warship piloted by zombie skeletons, which is just a really cool, little horror story. I don't know. It's interesting because we do, I think, typically think more of like ghost ships, and like either ships found adrift or ships where everyone has died because they were marooned or something like that. So I do think it's interesting to kind of take that concept to the sky. I mean, it takes all kinds. I imagine there's somebody that's seen something. I think the creepiest thing I've seen on an airplane is like, I guess when the temperature differential is just right, sometimes when the air gets pumped through, it kind of looks like a gas, where it's like you can see it like, vapor, and almost looks like the way it looks in movies when like they pump poisonous gas through the ventilation systems. So I definitely got freaked out seeing that one time, but that's about it for me.
I don't know about y'all, but I'm tired of these mother flippin' spirits on this mother flippin' plane.
Yeah.
And all this mother flippin' cocaine and these mother flippin' bears. What's up with that? It's just...
I remember when tornadoes were just wind and debris and houses and unfortunate children in Kansas and Nebraska. It was way
getting
before
carried to magical labs.
Way before they started putting sharks in all that stuff. There's a tornado culture war. Don't believe big shark. Also, snakes on a plane. That's how you know you got a good title for something. We want to hear your stories. We have a lot of people who are listening now, fellow conspiracy realists who work in the aviation industry, have a pilot's license, or have been on a plane and encountered something that is inexplicable. We would love to hear your thoughts. If you are listening to this and you happen to have a connect with our pal Crazy Mike, we'd love to do a podcast hanging out with Crazy Mike. Let us know. We try to be easy to find online.
Oh, indeed. check us out on the internet, where we are Conspiracy Stuff, on YouTube, on Facebook, where we have a group called Here's Where It Gets Crazy, and on Twitter, on Instagram, we're Conspiracy Stuff Show. Also on TikTok, we're Conspiracy Stuff, right?
Show.
Boom. TikTok as well. Lots of fun stuff popping off on Instagram and TikTok these days. Hey, catch us on TikTok before it gets outlawed, right, Ben?
Oh, yes. Carpe diem. And if you also like to live in the now, but you don't care for sipping the social meds, perhaps you're taking a dry January from the various online forms of communication and you want to go old school. You have a story to tell. Well, we want to hear it and we don't want social media to get in the way. Please do give us a phone call. You can use your telephonic device to hit the following numbers: 1-833-STDWYTK. You'll hear a familiar voice. Hopefully you'll hear a beep like so. Beep. You got 3 minutes. Go crazy. Go nuts with it. Give yourself a nickname. Tell us what's on your mind. Tell us if we can share your story with your fellow conspiracy realists. Most importantly, don't edit yourself. If you have other stuff to say, if you have some links you want to send us, we read every single email we get. All you have to do is drop us a line at our good old-fashioned email address, where we are
conspiracy@iheartradio.com. Stuff They Don't Want You to Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.